A prayer is said by heart by millions of Catholics, and printed just below it comes the name of a saint, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Not one line of it was written by him. This is not a specialist's doubt. This is arithmetic. The words on that slip of paper were only seen in the world 300 years after he was buried, and that piece of paper may well be in your house right now. Everyone knows this paper, thin, almost transparent when it is held up against the light, marked down the middle by a deep fold from being opened and closed so many times. The ink has worn away in the corner where the thumb always rests. On the other side there is a picture with faded colors. It tends to be kept in small places, between the pages of a missal, at the Sunday where it was left, at the bottom of a wallet, behind the papers, taped to the glass of a cabinet, forgotten inside the bedside book of someone who has died and never taken out because no one had the heart. And under the text, in tiny letters, 4 words, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. For a second, think back to your childhood. What was the first prayer you learned by heart? Write its name in the comments. The other answers are worth a look. Many will be the same, written in homes that have never met, and almost always the one who taught it was a mother or a grandmother at the side of a bed. A request that weighs on you can be left in that same comment. Someone in the family who is in prison, a brother who has died, a regret that has lasted for years. And if this video is being watched on a phone, do with this story what is done with that piece of paper. Put it into someone's hand. No holy card ever got where it is on its own. There was always someone who handed it over. There is a button down there marked Hype, and one tap carries this story to someone who has not heard it yet. Everything that comes in is read, and as much as possible is answered. Every request is prayed for, asking that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux intercede for you. And in the middle of this video, a man tears his own clothing in front of a crowd, not out of anger. Go back to the paper for a moment. Only one thing is written there, and it is enormous. It was never heard that anyone who turned to the Mother of God and begged her help was left alone. Never. Not one case is known in the whole history of the world. The boldness of that sentence is astonishing. It is not promised that the request will be granted the way the person wants. Something else is promised, harder to say and easier to feel, that no one is left without an answer. That is why this prayer is prayed so much. Whoever says it is saying deep down that he will not be the first to be forgotten. These words have been repeated in a hospital bed, in a waiting room, at a cemetery gate, in a prison cell. In hands that had nothing left there was that, and underneath all those people read the name of a French monk of the 12th century, who did not write it. So whose is it, and how did his name end up there? There are 2 answers, and both are documented. One of them has a date and an address, and it is stranger than any legend. But neither of the 2 can be understood before knowing who this man was. And here is the warning: a monk out of a holy picture, sitting and writing sweet things about the Virgin, he was not. No one in his century made more noise. One pope was made by him, another was unmade, whole villages were emptied, and his life ended with half of Europe blaming his name for it. Only he did not begin great. The beginning was small in a place nobody wanted, so bad that it was called by its own defect. We have to go back to the winter, when a valley called the Valley of Bitterness was reached on foot by 12 men, and one of them, 25 years old, looked at it and decided the name of the place would be changed. He was born in a village called Fontaine, 4 kilometers from Dijon in Burgundy in the east of France. It was around the year 1090. His father, Tesselin, served the Duke as a knight. Land, weapons, and servants were there in the house. Bernard was the 3rd of 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl. The road of a boy from that house was already laid out before he learned to walk. The horse, the sword, a good marriage, and the family name kept standing for 1 more generation. Only in that house, in what matters, the one in charge was the mother. Aleth of Montbard came from a noble family and did not live like one. She fasted. The sick were cared for by her own hands, something a lady of that position did not do, and the children were taken along so that they would see. Those who wrote her life a few years later kept one custom of hers. With every child that was born, she lifted the boy in her arms and offered him to God before handing him to the nurse. She died when Bernard was about 17. And here begins the part that is almost never told, because what came next was not a young man entering a monastery, it was a young man emptying his own house. He decided to become a monk, and he did not go alone. He went on convincing, one by one, the men around him. 4 of his brothers, an uncle, a knight in his own right, cousins, childhood friends. When he finally knocked at the door of the abbey, there were about 30 men behind him. The women of the family stayed behind, watching it happen. It is told that the youngest brother, still a boy, ran after the group, and that one of the older ones told him the family lands would all be his now. The boy answered that this was not justice, it was sharing out leftovers. Years later, he entered too. And the father, already old, was the last to arrive. One man entered a monastery and carried the whole family in his pocket. The abbey he chose was called Citeaux, and it was the worst bargain in Burgundy. It had been founded some 15 years earlier by a monk called Robert of Molesme, with a simple and unpopular idea to keep the rule of Saint Benedict to the letter, without the arrangements time had added. Real manual work, food without seasoning. No rents, no serfs working the land for them. The result was that nobody wanted to go. Citeaux was almost empty. The monks were few and old, and no novice had arrived for years. The house was going to end for lack of men. That was when 30 men turned up at the door at once. 3 years later, the house was overflowing, and when a Cistercian monastery filled up, the rule was to send a group out to found another one. In the year 1115, the abbot called Bernard, who was 25, handed him 12 monks and sent them north, to a valley given by the Count of Troyes. The valley had a name, and the name was a warning. It was called the Valley of Wormwood. Wormwood is a herb. It is the bitterest thing that grows in a European field, so bitter that it became the word people use when they speak of grief. The valley was called that because it was full of it, and because it was exactly the kind of place nobody asks for. Deep, squeezed between slopes, with the river in the middle and shade until late. It is worth stepping in there for a moment, because everything that comes afterwards is born from that ground. It is winter. The river Aube runs low and dark, with that mist that does not lift before 10 in the morning. The ground is soft. The 12 men come down on foot, with what they could carry, and the first thing they feel is not the cold, it is the smell. Stepping on wormwood releases a dry bitterness that stays in the nose and then in the throat. They will spend months pulling it out with their hands. There was no house. They made a hut of wood and clay with a floor of beaten earth. They ate barley bread, and in the first winters there were days of eating boiled beech leaves because the bread ran out. They got up in the middle of the night to sing the psalms and then went back to the field. The hands of those men, and several of them were noblemen, raised to hold a rein and a cup, split open in the first months and never closed properly again, and there was one more thing, and it could be seen from far off. Their habit was not black. The monks Europe knew, the ones from the great old abbeys, wore wool dyed dark. Those men wore raw wool, undyed with no color at all, because dyeing cost money, and the rule did not ask for it. The country people gave them the name that stuck, and that lasts to this day, the White Monks. A bitter valley, 12 men in white, and a young man of 25 in charge. He was abbot of that place for 38 years, and he never stopped being it. It does not matter how much comes later in this story. Kings, popes, crowds. His address was always that bottom of a valley, and he was the one who did the thing nobody expected. He did not build first. He did not ask the count for help. Bernard's first decision in that place was to change its name. The Valley of Wormwood stopped existing. He began to call it Clara Vallis, which means Bright Valley. From those 2 Latin words comes the name still used today, Clairvaux. It was not poetry, and it was not publicity. A year later, in a letter written by outsiders, the place already appeared with the new name as if it had always been so. The bitterest valley in the region had become the Bright Valley because a young man decided in one winter that it would be called that. Keep that scene. It will come back at the end of this story, and it will come back in a way nobody saw coming. His plan was simple. to go into a valley and never leave it again. That is not what happened. The man who chose silence spent the rest of his life on the road, and the reason is the most uncomfortable thing in this story. He spoke too well to be left in peace. Whole cities asked to have him as their bishop. He said no to every one of them. He refused the government of rich dioceses, refused honors, refused offices, and even so, with no title beyond abbot of a house lost in the countryside, he became the man whose opinion Europe waited for before deciding anything. When the church split in two in 1130, with two men calling themselves pope at the same time, he was the one the King of France called. Bishops and noblemen were gathered in an assembly, he spoke, and the whole of France changed sides in one afternoon. Then came England. Then Germany, then the emperor. A monk in a white habit, thin from fasting, deciding who the pope was. And it is honest to say that in that dispute, he also wrote things the church is not proud of. In a letter to the emperor to attack the rival, he appealed to the distant Jewish origin of that man's family. It was one line, and it is there, and it is not erased by quoting the others. A great man writes small things too. And there is something he did in those years that almost everyone has heard of, without knowing it passed through his hands. At the beginning of that century, a handful of knights in the Holy Land had decided to live in a way nobody understood. They took the vows of monks, poverty and obedience, and stayed armed, escorting pilgrims on the roads. The church did not know what to do with it. A monk does not take up a weapon. A knight does not take vows. In 1129, at a council in the city of Troyes, the head of those men went to tell how they lived. Bernard was there. The rule that came out of it with 72 clauses gave the thing a place inside the church. Afterwards, he wrote a whole text in their defense. Those knights became known as the Templars. Films, novels, conspiracy theories, everything told about them to this day begins in a room with an abbot in a white habit saying that such a thing could exist. In 1145, the strangest thing of all happened. The cardinals chose as pope a monk called Bernardo Paganelli, who had lived at Clairvaux under his orders. The subject became the superior of them all. The abbot wrote to his former monk, now Eugene III, and the first thing he said was that the news had frightened him. And then came the day he would carry to the grave. The 31st of March, 1146. Vézelay in Burgundy, a hill with a church on top. The King of France, Louis VII, wants to take an army to the east and asks Bernard to preach. The crowd that arrives does not fit in the church. It does not come close to fitting. They put up a wooden platform in the open field on the hillside, outside the walls, and it is from there that he speaks. It is the end of March, and it is still cold. The ground is trampled and loose, and the dust rises with the wind and with the movement of people. There is not one single sound. There is the continuous noise of thousands of people breathing, coughing, pushing to get closer. From the top of the platform, what he sees is a whole hillside covered in heads. He speaks. Nobody kept the text of that sermon, and perhaps it is better so because what remained was the consequence. There were cloth crosses prepared to hand out. Whoever received a cross and sewed it onto his clothes was publicly taking on the commitment to leave. That was the gesture, and the gesture had to be made with the hands. The crosses ran out, and then came what the crowd told afterwards and what the chroniclers wrote down. The abbot stopped, looked at what he had in his hands, and began to tear his own habit. That undyed wool that was his clothing, and the sign of his order, torn into strips there on top of the platform, and the strips passed from hand to hand so that there would be a cross for more people. This has to be heard properly. The sound of woolen cloth tearing is not discreet. It cracks, and while it cracked, hands went up. He was not angry. He was giving away the only thing he had on his body. In the months that followed, he crossed the Rhineland in winter, speaking in city after city. And in the end, the Emperor of Germany gave in as well and took the cross. 2 kings and tens of thousands of men set out. And now the hard part, which this channel will not dress up. It went wrong. It went wrong in a way Europe had not seen. The armies got lost, were surrounded, died of hunger, of thirst, and of disease long before any decisive battle. Between 1147 and 1149, the whole expedition fell apart without achieving anything. The best way to measure that is not counting the dead. It is looking at the villages. Houses that had 3 men were left with none. Women who said goodbye to a husband and sons on the same day waited years for people who did not come back. Fields with no one to plow them. A whole generation of one region left home because of a sermon on a hillside, and all of it rested on the word of one man. The reaction in Europe was immediate, and it was against him. The name that opened doors began to be said with anger. There were those who blamed him personally for every empty house. He was 56 years old, his health destroyed by 30 years of fasting, and he watched his own reputation turn to ash at the end of his life. What does a saint do in a moment like that? He could have kept quiet, and silence would have worked. He could have blamed the kings, and there was more than enough reason. The armies quarreled among themselves, disobeyed, made disastrous decisions. He could have said it was nothing to do with him. He did the opposite. He took up his pen and wrote. The text is called On Consideration, and it is addressed to Pope Eugene III, his former monk. It is a whole book of hard advice about what a pope should and should not do, written by a man who had the moral authority to say it. And in the middle of it, with no detour, is the subject nobody wanted to touch. He writes that they ran into it not at random, but under orders, and that just men went to a just battle, and even so they failed. He does not say the fault is the king's. He does not say that God changed his mind. He does not say the fault is his and leave it at that, which would have been easier and prettier. He says something more uncomfortable, that God judges, that his judgments are an abyss, and that the people of the Old Testament also came out of Egypt with a promise in hand and fell in the desert, as it stands in the book of Numbers, chapter 14. Moses did not miss the road. The people did not arrive. This is not an apology, it is an account rendered. He puts his own name under the disaster and goes on believing the cause was just, and those two things together are far harder than either of them alone. The man the whole of Europe obeyed ended his life signing his own mistake. 7 years after Vézelay, he died in the valley he had renamed, and his name began to travel without him. That prayer from the beginning of this video has a name. It is called the Memorare, which is its first word in Latin and means remember. It is the closing piece of a much longer Latin prayer, which appears in the manuscripts from the 15th century onward. Nobody knows who wrote it. Bernard died in 1153, which means those words were born some 300 years after his burial. And it is not only that prayer, this is where it gets serious. The hymn Hail, Star of the Sea, which the Church still sings at Vespers today, was attributed to him for centuries, except that the hymn is copied inside a manuscript kept in an abbey in Switzerland, and that manuscript is from the 9th century. Bernard was born around the year 1090. This is not a debate about authorship, it is simple addition. The ending of the Hail, Holy Queen, those 3 exclamations you sing without thinking, O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, is also given as his. And the story behind it is too beautiful to be true. It is told that he walked into a cathedral in Germany while the canons were singing the antiphon, and that when it reached the end, he cried out those words, and that the image of the Virgin answered, calling him by name. It is legend, and that can be proved. Those 3 exclamations already appear in manuscripts older than his own time, and the Hail, Holy Queen was already being sung in procession in a great French abbey more than 10 years before that night. They were not added by anyone, they were already there, and there is a 4th. The hymn of the Holy Name of Jesus, which begins by saying that the mere memory of Jesus fills the heart with sweetness, also carried his name for a long time. A Benedictine scholar, in the last century, went after the oldest manuscripts and showed that they all came from England. The author was an English Cistercian monk from the end of the 12th century, and nobody knows his name. And there is still a little book of meditations that circulated for centuries, with his name on the cover, sold at church doors, and which scholars today call Pseudo-Bernard. which is the polite way of saying somebody who passed himself off as him. 4 texts the church prays and sings, one single name underneath. Not one of them is his, and it is fair to ask why it was this name of all names. Why not another? The answer is almost a compliment. He became known as the mellifluous doctor, which means the doctor who flows with honey, because of the way he wrote and spoke about God and about the Virgin. For centuries, whenever a text about Mary turned up with no known author, full of tenderness and with no owner, the question people asked was, who else would write like this? And the answer that came back was always the same. So they wrote his name underneath, and that was that. He was robbed by resemblance. Now the mistake behind the first one, that one came from no resemblance at all, and the answer has an address. Paris, the 17th century. 500 years after everything you have heard so far, there lived in the city a priest they called the poor priest. They called him that because he was. He had been born into a family with means and had left everything. His work was prisoners, not prisoners in general, those condemned to death. In those days, a man about to be executed spent his last hours in a cell, and the custom was for a priest to stay there. The poor priest did this as his trade. He would go in, sit down on the stone floor with the man and stay until the end, and then come back and do it again with the next one. Step into one of those cells for a moment. It is narrow, and it has no window at eye level. There is straw on the floor, and the straw is damp because the walls sweat. The cold of the stone goes through clothing in a few minutes. The man sitting there knows the hour when he is going to die, and the hardest thing about that place is not the fear. It is that there is nothing to do with the hands. And the priest would put something into his hands, a sheet of paper folded with a printed prayer on it. He had more than 200,000 of those sheets printed, in several languages, to give to those who did not speak French. He paid for the printing out of his own pocket, poor as he was by vow, and handed them out, one by one, to prisoners, to the sick, to whoever he met in the street. That is how a prayer by an unknown author became one of the most prayed in the Catholic world. The name of that priest was Bernard, Claude Bernard. He was never canonized. He is not a saint. He has no feast. He has no image in any church. He was only Father Bernard, from Dijon. And that is where the piece fits, because in the reprints over time, somebody read Bernard and wrote Saint Bernard, and nobody ever corrected it again. One man was swapped for another. Both were from Dijon. The abbot was born 4 kilometers from the city. The priest was born inside it 500 years later. The most famous mistake in Marian devotion happened between 2 men born on practically the same street, half a thousand years apart, and the prayer kept on walking. 300 years after Paris, in a city in India, a small nun in a white sari with blue stripes was using that same text in a way nobody had invented before. When a case was urgent and there was no waiting 9 days, Teresa of Calcutta prayed the prayer 9 times in a row, one after the other, right there, standing, and she prayed a 10th time. That one asked for nothing. It was only to give thanks before the answer came. She gave thanks in advance. Her sisters still do it today all over the world, and the name that stuck for that practice is the Flying Novena. Stop for a second at the size of this, a text nobody knows who wrote in the 15th century. A priest of prisoners who spread it in the 17th century and to whom nobody gave the credit. A nun in Calcutta who prayed it 10 times standing in the 20th century. And the name printed underneath the whole time is that of a 12th century monk who never read it. One last turn is missing, and it is the strangest. The valley, the one he renamed the Bright Valley. The monastery lasted almost 700 years there. In 1792, the French Revolution confiscated the abbey and expelled the monks. 16 years later, Napoleon bought the place and put a prison inside it. The abbey church was pulled down. The great dormitory, where the white monks slept, became a gallery of cells. And Clairvaux became the largest prison in France, and it was that for more than 150 years. It only closed its doors in May of 2023. Look at the pattern nobody planned. The prayer with his name on it was spread by a priest who spent his life inside prisons. And the house he founded himself, in the valley he himself called Bright, ended up being one. In the last 18 years of his life, he preached on one book alone. He chose the Song of Songs, the book of love in the Bible, and began at the first verse of the first chapter. He spoke to the monks at night in the Abbey Hall. He gave 86 sermons, and he reached chapter 2. 18 years, 86 sermons, 2 chapters. He went slowly because he was not explaining a text. He was living inside it, and he never finished. Death came first, and he stopped halfway. In one of those sermons, something happens that nobody expected of him. His brother Gerard had died. He was the one who looked after the practical side of the abbey, the one who solved things, the one who was always nearby. Bernard stood through the whole burial without a tear, and the monks thought that was holiness. Weeks later, preaching about love, he broke down, and he did not leave. He went on speaking, weeping in front of everyone. He said he had held himself together until then and would not pretend any longer. He called his brother by name. He asked who he was going to take care of now. That was written down. Nobody erased it. The man who decided who was pope, who made kings change their minds, who tore the clothes off his own body on a hillside full of people, is kept forever weeping for a brother in the middle of his work. Now let a question come in slowly. How many prayers do you say without knowing who wrote them? You learned almost all of them by ear. Someone prayed near you so many times that the words went in on their own, and the one who taught you had learned the same way, from another person who learned from another. Not one of them is yours, all of them are yours. That is what a prayer is, something no one owns and everyone carries. And notice that this is how the church crossed the centuries, not by the great names, by the words that stayed in the mouths of people nobody wrote down. Someone wrote that prayer in the 15th century and did not sign it. Someone copied it, someone printed it, someone carried it into a cell, someone taught it to a child in a kitchen. Out of that whole line, history kept the wrong name, and the prayer arrived whole all the same. And then the printer's mistake stops being a mistake. That prayer from the beginning is an orphan. It has no known father. And when an orphan text needs a name, Christian people do not choose just anyone. They choose the one the text resembles. It says that no one who turned to the Mother of God was left alone, with no reservation, with no condition, with no other way out kept in the pocket. That is exactly what he preached his whole life. His name did not end up there by carelessness. It ended up there because it fits. And there is one sentence that truly is his. It is in a homily he wrote when he was young, about the angel who came to Nazareth, and which he himself said was the thing he was gladdest to have written. In it, he explains that the name Mary means star of the sea. And then he speaks straight to whoever is being carried off by the current. He says this, "If the winds of temptation rise, if you strike against the rocks, look to the star, call on Mary." The church still prays that text. Every 12th of September, on the memorial of the holy name of Mary, it is read in the official prayer of the church. Everywhere someone opens the breviary that morning, and almost nobody knows it is his. This video took 4 texts out of his hands. It gives one back. If this story touched you, send it to someone who has been walking in the dark for far too long and does not know where to look. And today, when you say that prayer you learned first, notice one thing. It reached you because one person put it in your mouth, and before that person there was another, and before her another, and nobody asked for credit for it. You are the last link for now. Look to the star. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, monk of the bitter valley that became bright, pray for us.